I just want to say a few things really quickly. There is so much happening in the country right now, as you all know, and I want to thank Nina for that incredible introduction. But, last night I was in Oakland speaking at an event, and it just hit my heart when a woman spoke. She said, "I want to say something," and she actually said that men are trash. No judgment. Can we say no judgment? And can we say safe space? But she used the word trash, but it's no different than what my mother, who turned 75 this year, has said my entire life. Don't be like your father, and men are no good, in the black vernacular. And so when we look at where we are in this country with that person in the White House, when we look at Bill Cosby, and I know many of the accusers of Mr. Cosby, we look at Harvey Weinstein. One of my good friends back in New York is the actress Annabella Sciorra, one of the many accusers of Harvey Weinstein. When we look at all the men, as Nina just said very eloquently, who have been accused, charged with all kinds of deviant behavior, I hope, especially to the men out there, folks who identify gender-wise as men out there, that we understand that patriarchy, misogyny, sexism are not new. Just like this country was quote-unquote founded on racism, the genocide of indigenous people, Native Americans, some folks call them Indians, First Nation people. Just like my ancestors, African people were kidnapped, were kidnapped from Africa and turned into slaves and built the economic infrastructure of this country. We need to be clear about that. The founding fathers, they didn't say founding mothers. And we know that those wealthy, heterosexual, white male landowners were engaging in power and privilege, and that was passed to all of us who identify as males in this society. Are y'all with me out there? And so that's the foundation of this country. And so Donald Trump is not some new phenomenon. He's actually a continuum of what we've seen all along. The difference with Donald Trump, he's just raw and completely unfiltered. And that's putting it mildly. But it's patriarchy, male domination, male power run amok. I believe, am I right, you all, Dr. Ford is from this part of the country, am I right? And it took me back to 2011 watching Dr. Ford during the Supreme Court hearings. In 2011, Eve Ensler, who's one of my sheroes and mentors, and if any of y'all are from the New York area, Eve and I will be doing a conversation in New York about this very issue on Sunday, November 4th. You can look that up. But Eve did a celebration of Anita Hill 20 years after those Supreme Court hearings. And when I was watching and listening to Dr. Ford, she was telling the truth. She was telling the truth. She was telling the truth. And as I was listening to Dr. Ford, I kept thinking about Anita Hill telling the truth, telling the truth, telling the truth. And it hurts my heart as a man, as a cisgendered man, as a heterosexual man, as a so-called straight man who's an ally, who had to learn to become an ally, to see so many of us who identify as males in 2018 still saying, well, why did she bring it up 35 years later? Well, the same reason why black folks are saying 100 years later, 200 years later, we still deal with the ills of racism. The same reason why our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender sisters and brothers, people in the LGBTQ community saying we still deal with homophobia and transphobia all these years. Are y'all with me out there? The same reason why poor people of all backgrounds say that poverty is a form of violence. The same reason why disabled human beings are saying, hey, able-bodied people, don't forget about us. And so when I think about where we are with this whole this thing called manhood, I want y'all to go on a journey with me for a second. Think about who you are if you identify as a man, and if you identify in other ways, gender-wise, think about the folks who are males in your lives. I was born and raised in Jersey City, New Jersey. As Nina said, I'm the product of a single-parent household, single mother. Shout out to single mothers out there. Always. My mother, like many African Americans, migrated from the South, from Texas, from Alabama, from Louisiana, from South Carolina, where she's from, to places like Oakland, California, like Richmond, California, like San Leandro and Hayward, or Brooklyn, or Jersey City, where I was born and raised. She was in her early 20s. She had already survived the racism and the sexism and the classism of the American South, being born in 1943, where her birth certificate said colored, not black, not African American, colored. She dealt with sexism growing up because by the time she was 8 years old, she and her three sisters, there was four of them, three sisters and a boy, only the boy was allowed to graduate from high school. All the girls had to work. My mother started working when she was 8 years old in cotton fields. She only got to the 8th grade. She was basically groomed not to have a career any other way other than to being the help for the privileged and powerful in her community. Are y'all with me out there? You know, this is where my mother came from. So she got on a Greyhound bus, as many black women did during those times, and she packed her life into suitcases, and they came up north. She and two of her sisters, and they shared one bed in a one-room apartment in Jersey City. And at some point, my mother met my father. She was in her early 20s. He was in his 30s. She fell in love with him, and he fell in lust with her. And he manipulated my mother, and he got my mother pregnant. And my mother was forced, when it was time to give birth to me, to call a taxi cab because she's a poor black woman in America. There's no resources, there's no cars, there's no drivers, like there's nothing. And she had to go to the hospital in a cab, and that's how I was born. I only saw my father, my first introduction to manhood, 3 times in my life, between the time I was born and I was 8 years old. And my father pretended several times that he was going to marry my mother. He would play games with her. Well, let's get married. And then he would pull back. My mother would call him periodically, can you help us? One time, he bought me a watch when I was a little boy. A second time, he bought me a bicycle. A third time, he was a truck driver, so he had money. He actually lived in a house that he owned, but we're living in a rat and roach-infested tenement. This is where I come from. My father, the one time I went driving with him in his truck, inside of his truck, I'm 6, 7 years old, are images of naked women. And when he saw my discomfort at the nudity of these women, he just started laughing and basically said a lot of what I heard from older men throughout my adolescence and youth. This is what it is to be a man. Are y'all with me out there? When I was 8 years old, it was a rainy day, I'll never forget it, my mother, we didn't have a telephone in the house, said we're going to go to the drugstore down the street, we're going to go to a payphone. I know y'all are too young to remember payphones. And she called my father, and she asked him again, can you help us? Can you help us? And on this particular day, his toxic manhood said, you lied to me, he's not my son, and I look like my father. And I'm not going to give you another nickel, near nickel, for him ever again, and hung up the phone on my mother. My mother was devastated, and she shared with me what my father had said. And right then and there, this 8-year-old boy, Kevin Powell, had a father hole, a manhood hole that was as wide as the Grand Canyon. Emotionally, spiritually, in every which way you can imagine. And whether you have a father or father figure in your life, or no father at all like I did, the reality is most of us who grew up in this society, whether we're white, black, Latino, Latinx, Asian, Native American, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, agnostic, most of us who identify as males are still bombarded, just like I was, father figure or no father figure, with the same images. This is what boys do, we wear blue. This is what girls do, they wear pink. Are y'all with me out there? You know? This is the kind of things that boys should be playing with. These are the kind of things that girls should be playing with. Are y'all with me out there? Boys don't cry. Boys have to be tough. Boys from early age, 5, 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old, start to police each other. We start to use sexist or homophobic or transphobic terms to describe boys who might be a little different than the so-called norm. Are y'all with me? Well, that was me. in this hyper-masculine culture. I played sports growing up. I loved football. I loved baseball. I loved every sport. You better believe that I fought every chance I got because meet us after school if you want to settle this. Meet us in the lunchroom if you want to settle this. It's this rites of passage many of us go through in our families, in our communities, all over the country and around the world. And one of the things that's included in that is constantly from an early age, unless you have a parent or parents or an adult who checks you as a boy and says, this is unacceptable to refer to girls in this way. It's unacceptable to diss boys in this way, to police them this way, and it's unacceptable to learn that to be a man is to be violent. And so I think about my childhood, and I talk about it in my writings, as Nina said. I mean, we would run around school, 4th or 5th grade, boys grabbing girls' body parts. Not realizing, gentlemen, men out there, we were learning rape culture at 8, 9 years old. Not realizing that when we use terms like gangbang, that's what we were saying. You know, I remember in my neighborhood there was a girl, and I'm embarrassed to admit this. To this day, I don't know her name, but the boys made a decision very early on with this girl that she was sexually promiscuous, as we say in the black community, loose. And so her name became Hori Dory. Meanwhile, the boys can do anything we want. But the girls, if it was even thought that they had done something, we twisted it around as if there was something wrong with them, just like what we did with Anita Hill and Dr. Ford. But it's not just our families and communities that shape us. It's also the schools that we go to. It doesn't matter, honestly, if you go to public schools or some elite private school. My mother, how far did I say she went in school? 8th grade. I'm the first generation after the Civil Rights Movement, so I went to the so-called best public schools in Jersey City, integrated schools. I was an A student K through 12. My mother did not tolerate bad grades. Oh, no, she didn't. Mama didn't play. And she still don't play at 75. But when I think about it, just like I didn't learn anything about black history or Latinx history or Native American history or Asian history growing up, K through 12, or queer history or poor people's history, guess what, y'all? My 13 years of school, I learned about Betsy Ross sewing the flag, 1. I learned about Florence Nightingale very vaguely, 2. Helen Keller even more vaguely, 3. And then Rosa Parks because she served double duty, black history and women's history. Now we're laughing about this, but if you want to understand patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, rape culture, ask the average male in your life, name me 5 to 10 women in American and world history and see how silent most of us go. So even though I was raised in a household, single mother, my aunts were around, my grandmother was in the South, there was a matriarchal family, the reality is, when we're talking about the things that we were studying, be it math, science, history, etc., everything was through the lens of men. As if women didn't exist. I knew from the time I was 11, 12 years old that I wanted to be a writer because I discovered this very hyper-masculine male writer named Ernest Hemingway. And I loved Hemingway. But in my 13 years of school, the only woman writer that I remember was Emily Dickinson. But it's not just there, it's also pop culture, the mass media culture. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but it should have broken our hearts when Frances McDormand won her Oscar back in February. Remember that, y'all, this year? And she asked all the women to stand up in that audience. And you saw all these women. I've worked in the entertainment industry for many, many years. Women are the real leaders in our communities. However, because of sexism, because of our need as men to control everything, we relegate you all to whatever we want you to be. So I grew up loving TV shows like I Dream of Jeannie. Remember that show? Where she called Major Nelson Master, and he would put her back in a bottle. And I'm thinking to myself, years later, wow, boy, was that reinforcing patriarchy and sexism. Or I'd watch shows that, it hurts my heart. I loved Happy Days. Remember Happy Days? The Fonz would snap his fingers and women would just fly out of the ceiling. Now, we're laughing about this, but as a boy taking this in, think about the devastating effect of these images. Just like the devastating effect of black folks seeing images of us only in certain ways that are stereotypical. Are y'all with me out there? This applies across the board. And so this is how it was socialized. This is how it was socialized. And so fighting was normalized, violence was normalized, not respecting women and girls as our equals, as our equals, as our equals, as our equals, which is what women and girls are, was not part of it. So like many boys, I get to college. Rutgers University, New Jersey. First year, first semester, probably the first week, an upper-class male student said to me, "There is so much sex on this campus, we don't need electricity to keep the lights on." Now, I'm naive. I'm green because I was very much a mama's boy. But I get to college, and I realize there's a whole kind of pimp mentality going on. There's student leader pimps. There's fraternity pimps. There's athlete pimps. There's even faculty and staff pimps, where the men were running amok with women and girls. I would hear stories about domestic violence. I would hear stories about rape. Y'all with me out there? Unfortunately, and I'm not proud to admit this, the boy who grew up where his mother told him, "Do not become like your father," in college is where I began to become like my father. Irresponsible sex, reducing women to two things, again, caretakers or sexual objects. Because I grew up in a violent environment means, I'm being honest with you all, I was violent in my early life, sometimes toward males, sometimes toward women in college. It hit a crucible for me after college. I was living in Brooklyn, New York. A girlfriend and I were living together, and we got into an argument. This is 1991, July 1991. My male rage, my anger, my fragile masculinity, when she challenged me, pushed her into a bathroom door. Not proud of it. Not proud of it. Years later, I would apologize to her, and she would accept my apology. But here's what happened in that summer of 1991. And this is why we need to have honest, open conversations with each other. Because when I look at a Bill Cosby, a Woody Allen, a Roman Polanski, a Matt Lauer, a Charlie Rose, a Harvey Weinstein, I'm saying to myself, no one ever checked these very damaged human beings as they were doing damage. There were women, and a few men, but mostly women, who said to me, "Kevin Powell, you're a hypocrite. How can you talk about injustice in the world and you're participating in the oppression of half the country and the world's population?" That was devastating to me. Equally devastating is when some women said to me, "You need to read Bell Hooks." And I said, well, that's an interesting name, and now who is that? We're laughing about it, but not only did I grow up not learning anything about women and girls in our history, my 4 years at Rutgers University, the only woman writer I read in college, Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God. That was it. And so even in college, when I thought back on it, after being challenged around that bathroom door incident, here I was thinking I was this brilliant young man, but when women leaders at Rutgers University would challenge us on our sexism, we would say disparaging, disrespectful things to them, because what men like to do who are engaged in toxic manhood is silence women and girls. I was told after that incident, you need to own your mistake, number one. I was told after that incident, number two, men, you must get help. What did that look like for me? It meant therapy. It meant therapy. It meant counseling. It meant therapy. All those traumas that I grew up with, I was now passing along, taking out on other people, including women. Are y'all with me out there? What did it mean? Number three, Kevin Powell, you need to start listening. Men, we need to start listening to the voices of women and girls. I was in my 20s taking all of this in. And number four, what was said to me? You need to become an ally, a consistent ally to women and girls. Number five, how do you become an ally? You must read. And I found myself, you must study. I was like, well, who is Bell Hooks? Who is Gloria Steinem? Who is Eve Ensler? Who is Audre Lorde? Who's June Jordan? Who's Sonia Sanchez? Who is Nikki Giovanni? Because I realized I was completely ignorant about women. Completely ignorant. Like many of us are. And it was hard to read things where women were saying very powerful things about what they had experienced at the hands of men. Y'all with me out there? But we don't have the kind of transformation that Bioneers represents if we as a people, no matter how we identify ourselves, are not willing to take hard looks in the mirror. And the last thing that became a part of it for me is that you have to do the work. And for us as men, that doesn't mean coming around women all the time. You've got to do that work with men and boys. It's like when my white sisters and brothers, and I love all people. Many white sisters and brothers around the country ask me, well, what can I do to fight racism, white supremacy, white privilege? I always say the same thing: work with white sisters and brothers and challenge them. So what can men do of any background? We've got to do the work. And so it began in 1991 with a terrible, terrible experience. I never engaged in that kind of behavior again. But I'm going to be honest with you all, it was a journey to move from toxic manhood and trying to figure out, well, what does healthy manhood look like? I've been taught that manhood is violence. I've been taught that manhood is ego. I've been taught that manhood is senseless competition. Are y'all with me out there? You know what I mean? I've been taught that men don't cry. They don't express themselves. I was taught that men can't be vulnerable. Are y'all with me? And I said to myself, wait a minute, here I am trying to figure this thing out, and there's all these wacky definitions out there about manhood in rock and roll, in jazz, in hip hop, in movies, on TV, in books. I had to question everything. That's how you begin to redefine manhood. You've got to question everything and ask yourself, what's wrong with love? What's wrong with peace? What's wrong with nonviolence? Y'all with me? So when I think about redefining manhood, can y'all say redefine? Manhood? In my humble opinion, 27 years later, wow, I've written about it, essays with titles like The Sexist in Me, Confessions of a Recovering Misogynist. I mean, these are the different periods of my life. I wrote a piece in my new book called Harvey Weinstein, and his toxic manhood is our toxic manhood. Because it is. Bill Cosby is us. Woody Allen is us. Roman Polanski is us. It's not just writing about it, speaking about it, doing workshops. I've worked in prisons, colleges and universities, community centers, religious institutions. This is an ongoing conversation. What I'm happy to say to you all is that over the last 27 years, I've seen more men get involved. But we still are a very small part of the solution. Are y'all with me out there? And so I want to say this to the men out there. I want to end this here because I know we got to wrap this up. And please come to the 4:30 session. To the men out there, if you identify as a male, hold your hand up for a second. If you look at all those hands out there. Let me say this to you all with all due love and respect. Again, women and girls are our equals, are our equals, are our equals, are our equals, are our equals in every single way. That's number one. Number two, even if you are not the kind of man who would ever call a woman a disrespectful name, touch her inappropriately, touch her without an invitation, rape her, molest her, assault her, God forbid, stab her, shoot her, murder her. And all these things happen in our country, on this planet. The New York Times Magazine said a few years back that ending violence against women and girls is one of the major human rights issues in the entire planet. Even you're the kind of man who would never engage in those things, but you have men around you, in your family, in your synagogue, in your masjid or mosque, in your church, in your temple, in your fraternity, on your sports team, at work, in your barbershop, wherever you go, where men gather and you hear men engaging in toxic manhood, destructive language and behavior toward women and girls. And you say nothing about it. We become just as guilty. So my great hope, because we have to have hope in spite of all that's happening right now, is that #MeToo, just like the civil rights movement a generation ago, will not only empower women like the civil rights movement empowered black people, but that movement empowered all of us. My hope to us as men is that we understand as women are using their voices, it should be the wind behind us and saying, I want to be a different kind of man and human being. I love you all. Thank you.